But the plan is for us to talk a little about antenna maintenance and then some of the things that folks don't always think about. And maybe you remember last week, and yeah, it's going to feel really weird not having David with us today. Uh, his stroke was right the next day after last week. But I showed this, and the question became, okay, what's wrong with this picture? This is not two stations, but this is how the facilities department at a Native American tribe installed a two-bay antenna. You have to look up to see it. And when they did that, their staff of that station, no, they weren't paying attention. They just noticed they had no coverage. And they called me and asked me what was wrong and how to fix it. And I said, well, first thing, the antennas need to be in the same direction.
They're doing moon bounce?
Yeah, something like that. So that was
Is there even a power divider on there?
no, that's just a harness.
I was gonna say, they look a little close to each other.
Well,
Yeah.
It doesn't look like a full wave spacing. I can't believe it would be half wave.
well, it's full wave. It's the angle you're looking at.
Okay.
I kind of took that picture later on when I got a chance to go down and take a look, and I said, hey guys, it's pretty clear what's going on here and what has to happen or what needs to happen. So we had kind of a laugh about it in a way. But yeah, I mean, you think about these things. Another thing I mentioned last week, another incident, a four antenna array, and that was half wave spaced. From the factory, the sections 2 and 3 were marked upside down, and the tower crew assembled it, and the Viswar was sky high. They couldn't keep the transmitter on the air. It was 2:00 in the morning with the CP running out. And finally, the guy that was out there got this bright idea to flip the antenna, and it worked. Now, the factory doesn't really want to admit that that's what happened, but that's what
Don't
happened.
they read instructions? I mean, don't they read the drawings? I mean, you know, that's fundamental stuff, Barry. I mean, for us, obviously.
Hi, Tim. You're a little soft there, but okay. The bays were marked, but they were marked upside down. And
From the
that's,
manufacturer?
sorry?
Yeah, human error. That's happened a couple times to me.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's just a human error, but it messes things up big time.
And maybe you remember the batteries that I showed you yesterday, 2 9-volt batteries, and the posts were reversed on one. So that what we would normally call the positive was on the negative side and vice versa. Came from the factory that way. Somebody that only saw the one battery wouldn't understand why it didn't work. So
Good help is getting hard to find.
So let's talk a little bit about maintenance issues here and trying to get it right, trying to get it so that we don't miss certain things. And of course, obviously, number one is if your antenna is up there 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, even 500 feet, if that's the closest you ever get to your antenna, that's going to require some additional attention. Now, what can you do? If we start at the top, because we can talk about the bottom in a few minutes here, which will be common and different for AM and FM. If you start at the top, how do you determine if your antenna is in good shape? there's two easy ways. Well, there's one easy way and there's one expensive way. The easy way is, are you losing a lot of air? A lot of dry air, nitrogen? If you're going through a lot of nitrogen and that tank is running out regularly, something isn't right. I don't know. Mr. Voris, do you have a rough idea? Have you had one of these where the tank will last years?
I have, but then I've also had it where you were constantly changing the tank out about every week and a half. And
What did
it
you
doesn't-
find?
well, we found that one of the connections on one of the bays with the inner bay had a torn O-ring,
Mhm.
and it was just enough to let it seep out. But then that wasn't a constant thing, because when you have warming and cooling and the metal expands and contracts, you know, if it expanded, it didn't seem to leak, and if it contracted, then you would start losing your pressure.
Very good. So then the second way of determining this is to send up a tower climber to take a look, feel around, and take some pictures. Oh, and there's a third way now, isn't there?
A drone.
Drone.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We took a lightning hit out in western Nebraska, the station we have up on the bluff, and or at least we thought we took a lightning hit, because when we did a sweep of the line, we found it to be open, and the elevation was at 274 feet, which would have put it right at the input of the antenna. So we thought, well, something's wrong with the antenna or something. We had a tower crew go up, and doggone, they didn't find a single thing. They took the thing completely apart and didn't find any burn spots, they didn't find anything wrong with it. Put it all back together. They fired up the transmitter down below, and everything worked fine.
Well,
Another one of those mysteries.
One of my New Hampshire sites, the dehydrator just kept running and running and running and running. I mean, it just constantly kept running. So we knew we had an issue. It was a 2-bay antenna on a 120-foot tower, so it wasn't hard to find it and fix it, but at 1,000 feet, not so much.
for those of you that are on YouTube, take a look here at the little chat box on the side, and if you want to take advantage and join our conversation, feel free to enter something there. Now, with the drones, Mark, have you run into the issue of height restrictions?
Yeah, I don't have a commercial license to fly above 400 feet. You know, my tower, I've got one tower that's 400 feet, and I can fly up to the top of that and effectively and be fine. But anything else, it's pretty tough to do. Like our tower here for Omaha, we're up 1,270 feet. So I'd have to have somebody that is commercially licensed fly their drone. Which consequently, I might mention, not that anybody here is going to make it to Nebraska next month, but our engineering SBE group is going to be hosting a day of engineering sessions, and Gary and Cindy Cavell will be joining us and giving us a program on drone technology. So,
Okay.
just FYI.
Are you in charge of the program?
I'm sort of.
You want to let folks know the date?
I can. I believe it is August. Let me look. It would be August the 9th. And it
Mark, is that in Lincoln or Omaha?
It's in Omaha.
There's-
Embassy Suites, La Vista.
You can
So,
come see my pretty face too.
yeah, Mary will be there helping us out as she always does.
You got special room rates for people that want to come, or a special entry fee?
There's special room rates.
They've got an early bird special going on right now.
And there's a courtyard on one side of that and then Embassy Suites on the other, if my memory's right, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
That is correct, Bryce. Uh-huh.
So you're a week after TAB.
Yes, we're in between Tab and the next week after that is Alabama.
Well, New Mexico's that week, the same week.
Mm,
I know because I'm going to it too.
really?
Yeah. I
Wow,
fly out of Omaha to the New Mexico show.
Wow, you can have a busy week.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, they gotta have them in there somewhere, because eventually it's the Madison, and then the fall
yeah.
radio show. And things like
Registered
that.
for Madison, ready to go there. Looking forward to that.
Let's go back to our antenna
Sorry.
inspection, shall we?
Sorry, didn't mean
Oh,
to
it's all right.
sidetrack.
That's all right. So we start off with the antenna, or is that the last thing we do? I don't know. Anyone have an opinion here? You could say, I would start with antenna sweep from the base. using-
Sometimes starting at the bottom is probably better, because it could be something with your connection at the bottom that might be giving you a problem. And you're right, sweeping the whole network would be obviously done from the bottom if you have the ability to do it.
Yeah, I have a signal hound with a tracking generator. And I use that for sweeping, and I also use it for OOBs. It works great with a laptop. I also am 107 registered for my DJI Mavic drone, and that's come in valuable. Now I want to get one with the infrared sensor, because then that tells you which joints up on the tower are frying.
Well, now that's the next thing after if we're starting at the bottom, you start with a TDR, if you want to see the whole system. And then we have the drones, and then the infrared, which could either be on a drone or on a camera or some other appliance that you move up and down. And you're looking for what? You're looking for connections that have gotten dirty, expansion, contraction, whether it be where the coax pieces come together or the rigid line.
Missing bolts. I've seen that. Bolts fall out.
Water and filters. I had a customer that had that. A
Another
harmonic.
thing that you can do is measure the DC resistance. If you have an antenna that's connected DC, you measure that and repeatedly, and it lets you know if there's a bullet or other defect in the transmission line or antenna that's coming. It's sometimes you have to measure milliohms, but a simple bridge will help you with that, or some multimeters can do that.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something on the AM side as well. I've seen AM towers where they become discontinuous, and either because of, again, contraction, expansion, paint, rust. You could really have a problem there. So it's useful to take a voltometer up there and take a look at what's going on.
You mentioned AM tower. If you have AM tower with an FM and an isolator, check the isolator. I've had one of those get blown out from lightning, and that was a nightmare.
Oh, sure. The isolator, the choke, lightning chokes, those things happen. We had one station down here where the lighting choke just burned up. They took it out and never bothered to do anything. And in the end, let's just say the base impedance wasn't what they had intended it to be. As you look
Ed.
up, hello,
Go ahead.
as you look up the tower and you observe the tower itself, and again, you could use a drone, you can use a telescope or binoculars or a camera, and you find something like this. And, you know, that particular one, the rigger saw that, climbed back down and said, no more. But for it to get to that point, you know, that didn't happen in one day or 1 week. That happened over a period of months, maybe even years. And whoever was in charge did not, well, how recently was that tower painted? Make a guess? Not recently.
Yeah, in the late 1800s, I'd say.
Something like that. And so you end up with a situation where, good grief, you could lose the whole tower. And in some cases, as you know, current zoning won't help you because towers were originally put up with an exception and a waiver. We have a question here in the chat box. What's the current cost for a TDR? And Mary responds that could be from $200 to $5,000, depending upon features. And that also would depend upon who does it. Do you do it yourself or do you hire somebody with experience that can interpret what's going on a TDR? Because that's important. Yeah, Ron over on YouTube saying good afternoon, and we all want to say good afternoon right back to you, Ron. Glad you're there. So now you've got, I mean, this is, I'm getting very scattered now. If we're at the bottom and we're looking at the metal itself and you look for rust, where else is there rust that you got to watch out for? How about the ground rod on an AM tower? Or an FM tower for that matter? Guy anchors. You don't want those things to rust out on you. I have some pictures of what happens when a guy anchor rusts through. What about the what's it called there? A turnbull? Where the guy wires come together.
Well, and not just rust, but corrosion, anchors in general. It's a good idea for one to dig down beside their anchors and see if there's any corrosion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now that's something you don't want to do with your landscaper. You want to have somebody that is experienced, because especially if you have a rusted one, you don't want them to hit it at just the wrong way and sever it, do you?
You know, you're absolutely right, Barry. I actually, on a number of due diligent inspections, when I look at a guy anchor out there in the field, it'll be just perfectly fine above the surface. And you go down 6 or 7, 8 inches below there, and you'll see about 30% of it eaten away.
Now,
Also, sometimes they'll take the safety out, the safety loop at the bottom, and they won't replace it. And then you wonder why the tower comes loose. I've had several of those where they've tried to replace the safeties. They didn't have the right bolts. They didn't have the right U-bolts. They didn't have the right hardware, and they just left it.
yeah, as was mentioned before, I think by you, that again, expansion, contraction, bolts, vibration. One of the stations that I worked 20 some years ago, the guy wires were so loose that they flopped in the wind. And the first thing I told the station manager, you need to have somebody come in and tension these wires. Oh, how much is that going to cost? Well, if the tower falls over, it's going to be a heck of a lot more.
I was going to say, not as much as replacing your tower.
Exactly.
You know, one should have a tower inspection done by a group once every 3 years. We just had one of our towers inspected here a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, it's a real good idea because they know what they're looking for and they know what you need to do to correct any issues.
Well, again, experience is important. And yeah, you can do your own inspection, but up to a point.
Yeah, but not everybody climbs.
No, I would not climb towers.
No.
I went up about 50 feet once and I said, that's enough.
I used to, but fell off a ladder and broke my back and decided no more climbing
But
towers.
you want to watch your ground system, your guy anchors. Bill Stepmeyer here on YouTube says the bond between the top of a skirted AM antenna system and tower never got much attention, and it's high current generally.
I think everybody should have a pair of high power binoculars. That can actually be a quick way to check things.
Yeah, that's the start. Again, you can use binoculars. You can use your handheld camera IR sensor, and you can get the large stuff. You can see the really agreed stuff that's really ready to fail. But you want to have an experienced tower guy to do a much more detailed look at these things. And Ron Cole says he stopped climbing towers after he turned 30. I know some tower guys that are in their 70s. Who knows Tom Silliman? Now,
Everybody knows Tom Silliman. Thank God. God bless Tom.
yes.
Let me revisit the tower inspection just briefly and just say that it's been a number of years since I've had to be personally responsible for any individual site. But I do recall that as part of our insurance underwriter, the tower had to be inspected X number of years. In other words, they wanted a written report. If the tower had fallen, they'd say, where's that report? When was it last inspected?
I thought it was interesting when Tom Labarge gave his little discussion with us early last month, I think it was, and pointed out that ground rods generally have a 10-year lifespan. So if
Depends on the soil too. I mean, like in New Jersey where it's brackish, they rot out a lot faster.
and I would say the same thing for your guy anchors. Now, some people encase their guy anchors in a lot of cement, and that's probably a smart thing in a way. Harder to examine them. But again, after a certain number of years, and there's a whole lot of these 1940s towers, late 40s, that are, again, starting to fail because they've never been given sufficient maintenance over the years. If you painted your tower regularly, if you watched for rust and resolved that, your tower will last a good long time. But if you're not paying attention, that is not going to help you very much. Hangers. Your coax and your rigid both require hangers, don't they? And if those hangars fail, or there was one station south of here that Dana and I got called to about 20 years ago. They had black tie wraps to hold the coax onto the tower. And what do you think happens with black tie wraps after a couple of summers? Yep. The coax was so loose that in the afternoons, it actually turned the antenna of the STL dish. And so every afternoon, it was kind of a weird deal. Every afternoon, they'd start to lose their signal. And our first recommendation was get a tower guy in there and tighten down the dish and tighten down the coax, and they didn't have that problem anymore. But again, how long did it take for it to get to that point?
Yeah, but I mean, anybody who uses plastic tie wraps for anything on a tower is incompetent or cheap, or they've never been taught the right way. I mean, you just don't use those.
But it happens
all the time.
I just saw one yesterday in this general area. I won't say who. I saw one yesterday where half the coax was loose and the other half was tied with black tie wraps. I did tell the station manager, and he said, "Woe is me, I'll have to do something." Ron mentions that not maintaining a Blau Knox tower is a serious crime, in my opinion. I can go along with that. Those were well-built towers. They've maintained them for many, many years, especially the big companies, you know, that run WLW, WSM, places like that. Those towers have had loving care over the years, as opposed to some in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I can attest to the WLW. I was in Cincinnati for 18 years, and that Blau Knox got a lot of attention. When we built the 100-meter aux tower just to the south of the Blau Knox, we spent a day looking at the isolator for the FM, the grounding system, the bolts, everything on that tower, and that one's very well maintained. I'm sure SB and the one in Manchester are as well. At least they hopefully are.
How about the ground wires? Anybody been cited for exposed ground wires? While we wait for somebody to comment on that, I'll ask Chris, out there at the old KRLA garbage dump site, did you have trouble with the ground wires popping up?
Actually, they just kept getting deeper as we added filter on top of them. So who knows where they are today, but they're not at a nominal distance below the surface.
But they were trying to get up and above, and you dumped dirt on them. Good idea.
The entire thing was, everything but the towers was sinking. So that's what happened.
Probably the second or third station where I was a full-time engineer, we had an FCC inspector walk in, and it was kind of a weird day. I think I've told some of the story before, but the first thing, he wanted to know where all the contracts were on our part-time announcers. And I asked him to show me where that was in the rules. And he flipped the pages for a few minutes and said, "Well, moving on." And out at the transmitter building, he found about 6 inches of a radial exposed, and decided to write us up for that and being overpower. He announced that we were at 954 millivolts at a mile, and this was for a 500-watt station. Now, again, if you've heard me tell the story, I'll stop real quick here and just say that he finally actually called back late in the day and said, "Oh, I misread my meter. It was only 95.4 millivolts." And the odd thing about that was that tipped me to the fact that the base and meter was bad and had gone soft. We got another 15% power out of that one in the end, which is good. Sometimes inspections are not as bad as you think, although dealing with this guy was a little weird. He went from here up to Las Vegas and was looking at a 4-tower DA, and using his field intensity meter was pointed off about 45 degrees to get his maximum reading. And the engineer said, no, the array's over there. And he says, no, this is how you do it.
Then there was a story of, I think it was in Las Vegas where the guy inspected and he was looking at the tower and says, the tower looks like that tower needs painting. I said, yeah, it probably does. Aren't you going to write me up for that? I said, what? Listen, unless you write it up, I can't convince the owner to paint the tower. So please write us up for that.
Sometimes that is something good. Jerry Olson writes, and Jerry, you're welcome to speak up here. He mentions black tie wraps actually are a little bit better than the white ones because they can take the UV hit a little bit better. And Bill Hearn is with us today, mentioning an antenna up 500 feet and seeing the viswar on the transmitter meter slowly creeping up. Sweeping the line, he found 3 bullets going bad in the rigid line. And yes, they were replaced before a catastrophic failure. Now, again, dealing with owners, especially if you're a contract engineer, and trying to convince them why they need to have a line sweep. This is it. Now, Bill, do you have any pictures you could show us? I don't have, I'm talking more than most of you, and I can't go dig for pictures this instant. But yeah, when you see these bullets that are cratered and corroded and falling apart. Bill also mentions the FCC didn't like finding several exposed burial radio wires, radials where the sand had eroded at a desert site. Yeah, that was our situation out here. We were out on the desert and the erosion. Yeah, I dumped more dirt on it. And I told the engineer in charge out in LA at the time was Larry Guy, and he says, good, you did good. Don't worry about it. And that's something that I think we kind of miss in a way. In the day, the inspector was there to help you rather than to write you up. In this transition from the regular inspections that went on to the ABIP plan, where now you get an inspection and you don't get cited, but you get told to fix it. The regional, the guys, some of them you have heard their names over the years, I'm sure. They would come out and they would say, you need to fix this. You need to take care of that. I remember when Dane Erickson pulled up to a radio station here. It wasn't mine, but he knocked on the door and he says, gentlemen, you need to recalibrate your mod monitor. And he helped them do it. And that to me is really the spirit of the whole thing. Ron mentions on YouTube an FCC inspector showed up, wanted to see the AM directional. I showed him the STA where we were operating non-directional at night because Tower 2 was not working and was waiting on parts. I assume, Ron, that was with lower power if you were only running on one of 2 towers. Bill says he didn't have bullet pictures handy, but remembers they were burned black. Now, one of the things that contributes to that, and maybe someone would like to speak to this, when the pressure, okay, I'll start here. How much pressure should you have on your coax? Half a pound, 1 pound, 3 pounds, 5 pounds, 10 pounds? What is the proper pressure on a coax?
I've been running 5 pounds forever and get about 5 or 6 years out of a bottle of nitrogen. So it must work okay, I guess. Or I've been really, really lucky, one or the other.
About 3 pounds on mine.
Yeah, around 5 on most of mine, plus or minus.
Yeah, 3 to 5. If it's a new system, I'll go with the manufacturer's recommendations if it's a new line. And whatever the height is, because I mean, obviously if it's 1,000-foot tower, you're going to put a little more pressure on it. If it's a 200-foot tower, you might only run 3 pounds. I actually run in one of my New Hampshire sites, I run 2 pounds because it's just a short run.
Yeah. Yeah.
My understanding is that it just needs to be above atmospheric so that moisture goes out instead of comes in.
Oh, absolutely. But if you have a small leak and you're running a half a pound, you're going to exhaust that pretty quickly. And here we go with the burned out bullets. Because what gets in there when the pressure goes away? Water. There was an article that we published a long time ago on Radio Guide that was written by one of the antenna manufacturers that pointed out that it wasn't necessarily nitrogen being the best thing, that sometimes dry air was better than nitrogen. Now, I'm not an expert on that and can't remember the exact date of that article, but you know, if you have one of those little dry air makers, Andrew made them, for instance, and you changed out the crystals when they started to change color and kept the air dry, you were pretty safe. But then again, if you didn't and water got into the lines, all sorts of things could happen.
There's some sites that you can't get a nitrogen tank up there unless, you know, you're going up with a track vehicle or whatever. So we do use dehydrators in a number of locations, and we log a 6-month maintenance window on those. So you check the crystals. I've baked many a tin of crystals in my oven here at home. And it, you know, it's a little bit cheaper than replacing nitrogen tanks. And then I've got some sites where you have to take a tank up with a track vehicle. So you just maintain the dehydrator.
Yeah. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the system. If you know you have a leaky system, you know, now you've got a pretty difficult choice to make. You can, as was mentioned by one person, that you go through bottles of nitrogen or whatever. Or if you're running an Andrew dry air maker, what happens if they run too often? Well, they burn out. They don't make any more dry air. Pressure goes down. It's just one of the things that I think if you have especially a taller tower, I think probably it's a good thing to have a meter on your pressure to let you know when something's starting to go funny.
The dehydrators have alarms, and that's the nice thing about those is they have run alarms, they have low power, low pressure alarm, high pressure alarm. You know, I'm dead, call home alarms, and a nitrogen tank, unless you have a sensor on that, you don't really know.
Yeah, you'd have to have a sensor, but
Yeah.
Even with an alarm, they have to be hooked up, right?
Yeah, to something, yeah.
This is completely away from dry air and such, but we had a station that I'm aware of that had a dummy load, which was a air-cooled dummy load. But what does that mean? That means when you're using it, the fan has to be on. Well, if you don't interlock it and you switch transmitters and put your one transmitter into your dummy load at full power without a fan, what happens? In one case, they burned out the element twice within a month. And I told the guy, get your interlock going. Oh, I'm busy. The other one, a morning crew. How to put this the kindest way? Well, these are highly paid guys. But in one particular day, they let their live assist run out and there was dead air. So rather than acknowledge that, they decided it had to be the transmitter and they pushed the button to switch transmitters. Dummy load was not turned on and became a piece of molten metal on the floor of the transmitter building. Interlocks are important. Maintenance visits to make sure that the interlocks work are important.
Hello.
Hey, Grady.
It's Grady here. Hi, all. I wanted to tell y'all a story without mentioning any names, but there was a radio station that I was doing consulting work for, and had a main and a backup transmitter. And the place that they went when they were switching transmitters was to sit at a desk that was behind the transmitters and use a laptop to control the antenna switch. And someone had wired the interlocks up carefully, but not to the interlock connection on the main transmitter. They had wired it up somehow to an off command and an on command for the plate circuit, but they would switch the transmitter when they were at the transmitter site with it in local control, which defeated the plate off, plate on command. And I happened to be standing in front of the transmitter when they did this thing. And I saw the transmitter not go off the air and saw the reflected power meters jumping and saw the two red lights come on the RF power amplifiers as the thing burned up. And I couldn't get them to listen to me. They blamed it on the transmitter manufacturer, and they got the transmitter manufacturer to take the transmitter back so they could buy another brand. It was pretty obvious that the person who installed it didn't understand what an interlock is and where to hook it. I'm done here. Just thought you'd like to hear that story.
Oh, I like that. It brings to mind contactors at the base of towers that are not interlocked, or there are guys, some of whom used to be on, well, still on the broadcast list. They parroted the fact that their manager in their big market didn't want any dead air, so they switched hot 50 kilowatts. Not a good idea. But I guess if you're going to pay to replace the contactors every couple of months, what are you going to do? Remote control.
Isn't that more downtime than shutting down for 1 second or 2 seconds?
You sure would think so, wouldn't you? Of course, that was all done at 3 a.m., wasn't it? Another thing with
The
remote
failure point. The failure point could happen going into morning drive.
absolutely.
AHJ used to switch hot. They had all vacuum relays in their phaser, and they actually got away with that pretty well until suddenly the loudness wars started, and they started feeding the square waves to the transmitter, and the transmitter didn't like that anymore.
Talking about remote control and interlocks, another horror story, if you will. Went to work for a major consolidator, and their main station, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just started drifting from 100% to 107 or 108%. And first time I saw that, I said, well, okay. Looked up the instructions, and it was power trim was number 4 on the remote control. So I went to remote control number 4 and pressed lower, and transmitter promptly went off the air. I looked at myself quickly, got it back on the air, and made a mental note the next time I went to the transmitter building to trace out, see what's going on, test out. Eventually, what I found was that 4 lower was wired to filaments off. True story.
Here's another one of those true stories just like that one. It curls your hair when you find these things. A client station that I had 20 years ago that sold twice, and I didn't want to work for the new owner. I was looking for somebody, so I sent my assistant second banana person who was looking for work over there, and they hired him. And he's trying to figure out why the remote control phase and ratio readings aren't reading right on this multi-tower array. And after a while, he just goes and traces out the telemetry wires, and the phase and ratio samples were backwards on 2 of the 5 towers. So he figured that out, and he swapped it and recalibrated it. And all of a sudden, after all these years, everything makes sense.
We've talked in the past about why it's important to know what the factory numbers on a particular transmitter were, what the initial readings on the station log after the transmitter was installed and operating, and the fact that you keep track of that over the years. The old tube transmitters, of course, that was the way of knowing when the tube was starting to get a little flat, when the numbers started to climb in order to make power. But if you don't check, and there's one thing here that there's actually 2 items that we haven't mentioned at all that need attention. One is your coax switcher. Most stations that still have an auxiliary transmitter have a coax switcher in place so that you could switch either transfer to a dummy load or to the antenna. And then after that, there is generally a filter if you are on a shared site. 1 filter, 2 filters, 3 filters, more. Those filters can get hot. Went into one transmitter room and there's this huge fan blowing on the filter. Guys, don't you think it's time to bring somebody in to bring the equipment and tune that filter properly? You know? Again, sometimes you're dealing with a manager that's not quite with it, are you? What other things can we talk about in terms of outside the building, tower maintenance? We've talked about gates around an AM tower. Yeah, you might want to have a gate around your FM tower too, but the reason for the AM tower is a little different. The FM tower, you don't want them climbing it. And sure enough, every so often we read about some guy climbing up on an FM tower, sometimes naked, and sitting up there until the cops come and bring him down. AM towers, of course, can burn someone. And I think the best story I ever heard was from, I think it was Glenn Walden told me this story about the station in Philly, 50 kilowatt. And it had the balls at the bottom of the gap were, big. And one day the engineer went out doing his maintenance routine inspection, and noticed that one of the two the balls was missing. The lower one, the one connected to ground. And he was looking around, and on the upper ball, he suddenly noticed a handprint. As far as I know, the thieves never came back. And as far as I know, Glenn said that he had suffered his own punishment. Sort of like the pictures you see of people trying to break into power vaults to steal the copper. And every so often, one of them turns into a very smoked, burned up corpse.
Crispy critter.
Thank you. That was the word. I have a picture from, I think, Dallas, where that happened at a station. So you're going to inspect your ground system, make sure that it's underground the best you can. You're going to watch your guy anchors, and you're going to watch your guy connections, your guy tension. Do you have an air conditioner at your transmitter site?
Tower lights,
Tower lights?
especially for those that have towers that are miles and miles away. Good idea to make sure that lights are all working.
Do you do that visually, or do you do that simply by?
Well, seeing our tower's 3 hours away, yeah, I stand up on the roof and I can see it. No,
Well,
it's all remote.
You could have a neighbor look at it for you.
We could, but
Camera?
farmers up there are pretty busy. I thought about a camera would be nice, but finding a decent outdoor camera that's not gonna fail or whatever is. No, I've got everything remoted. If I have a light go out, I'll get an alarm.
Mhm.
I do fortunately have a guy up there that will go change the bulbs if I need him to.
Well, I'm gonna raise a question, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but since you're talking to me right now, when was the last time you checked your photo sensor?
2 weeks ago. When
To
we
make
had the
sure-
tower, when we were inspecting the tower.
And so you know that it turned on at the right light level?
Yep. Yep.
A blessing on your head, Mark.
I know.
I think everybody else here, including you, know of stations where that light sensor has never been checked.
Yes, and I have seen situations where that particular light sensor was replaced by something they picked up at Home Depot, which is not kosher, because the sensing of the photocell is a little different, I guess I was told. So
And it needs to be pointed north.
and it has to be pointed north, correct?
I actually had an FCC inspector check it physically. He actually, now, all he did was put his hand over it, but he did check that the photocell worked.
Mhm.
An
Well,
FM station I had once, I had a little cardboard box that would just fit right over snugly over the whole photocell enclosure. And I could reach it from the ground. So I just reach up and slap the box on there and step out of ways, and yep, all the tower lights are on. Yep, we're good.
in the good
And I
old
had
days-
it marked. I had it marked on the box, photocell tester, so nobody would throw it away.
In the good old days when we actually had SLRs, many of us carried those light meters. And you could actually get an actual reading to correspond with the amount of light there was.
Well, presumably your lights come on and you can see it on your remote control, which I think you're supposed to check all the time. But assuming the lights come on, I think that means the photosensor is at least working. It may not be calibrated to the exact brightness, but at least you know it came on.
Yeah, and of course, and there's another factor here that in the old days, it wasn't considered that important, but in recent years, the commission has got a little more, or the FAA or both of them, making sure that all your lights are on. If you lost a side light, for instance, you might not know that unless somebody drove by and told you. Or in some cases, if your side lights are on, but your beacon was off, unless you were watching to see the change in current levels, you might think, well, the lights are just fine. Look, it's drawing current.
Well, I have a nosy next door neighbor. Actually, she's really very nice that tells me if I got a problem, like the generator's still running, you know, things like that. And even commented on our lights one day. So that's a big help. I've been thinking TV cameras though, since we have an IP connection directly from studio to transmitter site. Some of these, I mean, there's cheap cameras now. I haven't figured out how to run wiring to them. I'd feel a lot better with something that's actually wired rather than wireless. But there's a whole bunch of them out there that are not real expensive. You could certainly point them at the tower and find out, see if the lights are actually on. And as far as the side light thing goes, the FCC sent me a nice email many years ago saying, please turn your side lights off because it kills birds. So we went through about 3 months of paperwork trying to get that shut off, because it wasn't as simple as just replying to the email, which this would have been too easy because I could have gone and turned the breaker off and we'd be done. But oh no, we had to get the FAA to sign off on it and the FCC to sign off on what the FAA did and so on. It took forever. But at any rate, I don't have to worry about those nasty side lights anymore.
You know, when it comes to cameras, so for tower lights, I think the big key is getting your camera out far enough away from the tower to be able to see all your tower lights. So if you've got a place, and I've often thought with our tower up north, the neighbor across the road's got a farm shop, and thought about sticking a camera over there on his shop that looks up at the tower. Of course, then the problem is in the wintertime when the camera gets all snowy and iced up and stuff, then, well, that can be a problem.
Well, we don't get too much snow in Texas, thank God.
Oh, no.
But it still happens. It happens enough, you know.
Yep.
And you're right. I do have to walk off probably 100 feet away from the tower to be able to look up the thing to see the top beacon. Otherwise, you just can't see it.
Right.
There are a number of cameras out there now. Some of them are PoE, power over the Ethernet. Some of them are Wi-Fi, as you mentioned. And then there are some that are, you know, you plug in and run an Ethernet cable or regular cable. Depends on how many towers you have and such.
Just one that has to be lit, so that solves a lot of the problem. But
Well, I don't know about that. Chris, Marvin's not here today, but were you at all involved with that Santa Monica 1580 with the way it's sitting there with a hill around it? The beacons were literally right at the window level of the houses around.
Yeah, there were complaints from the residents, and I guess they decided, well, you probably really, by the way, for many years, those towers were not lit. So there was something that changed, or some inspector decided, no, you got to light them. But they eventually decided, well, you know, you probably don't really need beacons on these. Just put conventional, 103 watts side lights at the top. And they didn't have any complaints after that. But that is unusual because the tower has no flashing beacons. And I think 4 of the 6 are lit. It's a perimeter thing.
Yeah, they only had to do the 4 corners, and Marvin told me a lot of that story, but it was weird. I mean, because people look right out their front window and there's a flashing beacon there.
I used to drive by that a lot, and I noticed one day that one of the tower lights was kind of looking funky on the one corner. And I told Marv, and he went down and said, yeah, it looks a little strange. And eventually somebody climbed up and discovered apparently a lightning strike had blown the controller all to pieces. We surmised that probably the only thing that was lighting it was the RF.
My favorite is when the strobes are on day mode. I mean, I'm sorry, on night mode during the day. And they last for a couple of weeks, and finally one of the neighbors calls the police and says, you've got to stop this. It was a remote situation. Nobody was aware of it. It was a contract engineer, not me. And I guess the police finally got involved and ended up contacting the radio station to get it out of night mode. It was day mode, whatever it was, opposite. It was blinding at night. Let's put it this way.
Plus, if you have low clouds, that strobe will just illuminate the bottom of the clouds. Quite an interesting display.
I guess it's a good thing the neighbor didn't have a long gun.
So it's a whole different bullets.
So I had a similar situation a couple of weeks ago on a 1,200-foot strobe tower where I've got a neighbor that lives off to the southwest of it, and she contacted me to tell me, hey, it's operating in day mode at night and it's killing me. Well, I went down and found that the controller was all out of whack, and I reset the power to it, and that resynced the lights. And then, researched why I didn't have an alarm, and got to the bottom of that and scheduled the tower crew to come visit. But it's good to have a neighbor that, will text you and let you know if there is a problem.
Yeah, I used to offer CDs or other little, pens or things like that to a neighbor that was willing to be neighborly.
Yeah. Well, and the other call I made after that was to the dispatch for the law enforcement in that county and told them, if you get calls, here's what's going on. And the tower's got a NOTAM on it now. So.
The installation out here on Tucson Mountain, west of the city here, was put up after a huge zoning fight. In fact, the original building was all done by helicoptering people in and out. And eventually they were able to put a road up, most of which was unpaved and no lights. And even the light at the door of the transmitter building had to be on a timer. And if that got stuck, complaints rolled into the sheriff's department and gunshots were heard. But thinking of remote control and the situation with what remote controls could do or couldn't do, you think about the point that you mentioned, Bryce, getting out of sync. I remember one particular station where the computer, now this is pre-internet, okay. Yeah, no, it wasn't it was post-internet, but it wasn't hooked up. And so the time drifted. By the time I got to that particular station, they were 25 minutes off. And so the swap from day to night pattern was 25 minutes late. I mentioned this to the GM owner, and he says, what's it to you? Am I interfering with your station? I said, no, just trying to be a good neighbor. Ron mentions at the TV station, the operating engineer had to go to look at the lights every night after the 10 o'clock news. There you are, visual verification each time. He also had an issue with the strobe getting stuck in day power, and the farmer would call saying, cows can't sleep.
I remember when I worked out west at KRVN radio, our AM site was about 40 miles away from the studio. Studio was in Lexington, the transmitter site down Holdridge. And we had an overnight guy that said he checked the tower lights every night to make sure that they were on. And we knew it couldn't be possible because you can't see the AM site from the studio. Oh yes, I can step out the side door here and look out to the south and I can see all the towers. Yeah, it was the hill south of Lexington where all the FM and other towers were located. We finally had to tell him, sorry, you're not looking at the towers you think you're looking at, because he would log it. He would actually log it. Yeah, they're working.
Wow. XA Castle here on YouTube says we have a camera on ours being monitored by the Burke. Well, yeah. Is it monitoring a current, a voltage, or does it have a sensor to give a dry contact? All possible solutions.
Yeah, ours in New Jersey had current sensors on them. And they had a watchdog on each of the 5 towers. And so if the watchdog missed a count, we'd get an alarm. It seems to work out pretty well. But it would also indicate if some of the marker lights were out and stuff too, you'd get a different reading on it. So we did a faster.
Well, it's much more possibility today. The technology has given us the ability to measure precisely the current going, and you know, when you have 2, 4, 6, 8 side lights and a top light or something, you can tell immediately if any one of them is out. But it's important to check.
Yeah.
The ABC used to be able to do theirs visually when it was on La Cienega. The only problem occasionally was being near the coast. Occasionally the fog would roll in and the guy would go out and couldn't see the tower, much less the tower lights. So you had to make an entry in the log to the effect of unable to see tower due to fog or something.